Welcome again to our series of lectures on the foundations of Western civilization. This time, lecture number 22, on Rome's golden and silver ages. That is, on the cultural life of the Augustan Principate, to which we addressed ourselves in our last lecture. Now let's say, by way of beginning, that the inception of the Principate provided for several crucial conditions that were conducive to a high level of cultural achievement. Peace and security after a century of disturbances. We don't want to push that point too far. We certainly know of moments in human history when tremendous cultural achievements have been associated with times of great instability and war and violence and famine and other things. But this was nevertheless not the case in the first 2 centuries AD. This was a time of peace, stability, order, good government, and in that climate, culture flourished. It was a time of great wealth. It was a time when the Roman state was wealthy, when the Mediterranean basin was wealthy, and when particular individuals, yes, the imperial family at Rome, but individuals throughout the empire were wealthy, and more importantly, were willing to spend their money on great cultural achievements, financing great buildings, supporting great writers, and so on. It was, finally, a time when reflection on Rome's past, reflection on Rome's character, reflection on what Rome had once been was really quite natural, because that world of older Rome, as we saw in our last lecture, was gone. And although there were people who were nostalgic about it, there were no longer people who were actually willing to lay down their lives to try to recreate it. So in a very real way, the effort and energy that was spent recreating that world was spent by authors, was spent by people who wrote about that older time. Now, the reign of Augustus has often been called the Golden Age. This was the age of perhaps, well, indeed, of many of Rome's greatest cultural achievements. It was also one of the great ages of poetry in all of Western history, and a remarkable array of gifted poets at this time. Let's begin then with these poets. Let's take them as our entree to the Golden Age. We'll come to the Silver Age, the rest of the first and the early 2nd century, a little bit later. So let's use these poets as our entree to the Golden Age. And let's begin with the greatest of them, Publius Vergilius Maro, Virgil, born in 70 BC, died in 19, called by no less an authority than Tennyson, wielder of the stateliest measure ever formed by the mouth of man. Virgil is one of the true immortals, one of those poets who was read in antiquity and who has been read ever since, who has always been known by educated persons. He is best known, of course, for his great epic, his composed epic. I'll explain what I mean by that in just a second. And this is the Aeneid, the story of Aeneas, the founder of Rome. Now, you remember perhaps a couple of lectures back, I talked a little bit about Aeneas, whom I called the dullest character in epic literature, by way of simply eliciting some of the values that the Romans wished to hold up to themselves, what the Romans wanted to see when they looked in the mirror. Well, there's a great stock of stories and of traditions and of legends and of word of mouth and of probably urban legends as well that hide behind the Aeneid. But where this great poem is concerned, the first thing we need to say about it is that Virgil wrote it from the first word to the last. Now, actually, when Virgil died, about 24 lines of this poem were incomplete, and he wanted it destroyed. The Emperor Augustus, we are very grateful, violated Virgil's will, and he saved the Aeneid for us. And we don't mind those few lines that are incomplete out of his 12 books and many thousands of lines. Now, Virgil is mainly remembered for the Aeneid, but it's worth just briefly mentioning that he wrote other poems too. He wrote 2 books of poems, the Georgics and the Eclogues, which are technically accomplished poems, much admired in later times as models of Latin poetic meter, you see. And these are poems that were in praise of the countryside, poems in praise of traditional rural life. So let's don't forget that Virgil wrote more than just the Aeneid. But the Aeneid is one of the great masterpieces of world literature. Its theme is a somber one. Its theme is the somber dignity of Rome's past. There's no boosterism in this poem. Virgil was not the sort of fellow who would have run around yelling, "We're number one." In almost dirge-like quality, the poem's dactylic hexameters. Now, you may recall we talked about dactylic hexameters many lectures back when we talked about Homer's Iliad. A hexameter is a 6-foot line. A dactyl is a poetic foot which consists of 1 long and 2 short beats. Boom, boom, boom. Boom, boom, boom. The 5th foot of a dactylic hexameter line is always the dactyl. The 4th might be, but the 5th must be. So Virgil composed his poem, line after line after line, in their hundreds and then their thousands, in dactylic hexameter. We're very unfamiliar with dactylic hexameter in English because English almost cannot be written in dactylic hexameter. The rhythms of our language just don't lend themselves to it. The 33rd line of the first book of the Aeneid is where, in a certain sense, Virgil gives away his theme. Here is where, in a way, he tells us what his great poem is going to be about. Let me quote it for you, and I want you to listen to the solemn, dirge-like quality of the Latin. And bear in mind that this goes on, line after line after line in the Aeneid. Tantae molis erat Romanam condere gentem. There's something very dignified about that, something very graceful, something very elegant. And it goes on and on and on. Now, I could have read it a little bit faster. What does it mean? More importantly, what does it mean? Well, as I said a moment ago, Virgil's no booster. He's not going around, oh, we're number one, we're great. This line says, oh, what a job it was to found the Roman people. Tantae molis erat. Such a great burden it was to found the Roman people. Boy, it was a hard job, but we stuck at it and we got it done. That's his great theme. From the time when we first meet him, Aeneas is carrying his father Anchises, his aged father Anchises, on his back out of burning Troy. Well, remember in an earlier lecture, we talked about those Roman families, we talked about that paterfamilias, we talked about deference, we talked about ancestors. So we meet Aeneas, not fleeing Troy, saying, I'm out of here, but carrying his aged father on his back out of the city. That's when we meet Aeneas. That's the first time we're told, okay, now this is what you're supposed to pay attention to. Want to know how to be a Roman? Mind Aeneas here. But we also are somehow told, we just know that Aeneas has set forth on a mission from which he will not be deterred. Now, along the way, we meet family devotion, we meet honesty, we meet integrity, we meet determination, we meet courage, we meet humanity. We meet, in other words, all those typical Roman values. Now, it'll occur to you in a moment that my argument here is a bit circular because in the last, well, a couple of lectures back, I used the values in the Aeneid to tell you what the Romans were like. Now I'm telling you that the Aeneid was the book that told the Romans what to be like. So it is a bit of a circular argument. But here is the mirror in which the Romans wished to see themselves. Yet Aeneas was harried by Juno, the goddess who had favored the Trojans. This enters an interesting note in the music, because it shows that everything was not to be smooth and easy for the Romans, that there were other people out there. They had their interests too. They had their qualities. They had their problems, and that Rome was going to struggle. Remember, it was a big job to found Rome. It wasn't easy. Well, at one point, Venus, Aeneas's patroness, went to her father Jupiter to ask if Jupiter, were going to remain true to his promises. He'd made her great promises for Aeneas. And Virgil put these words into the mouth of the chief of the gods. In doing so, he told us something about the early years of Augustus's reign. He tells us something about the way the Romans see themselves. He tells us something about their sense of destiny. So, Venus has gone to her father and said, you know, Juno is stirring things up and making awful problems down there. Aren't you going to fulfill your promises? Jupiter says to her, fate remains unmoved for the Roman generations. You will witness Lavinium's rise, her walls fulfill the promise. You will bring to heaven lofty-souled Aeneas. There has been no change in me whatever. Listen, to ease this care, I will prophesy a little. I will open the book of fate. Your son Aeneas will wage a mighty war in Italy, beat down proud nations, give his people laws, found for them a city. To these I set no bounds in space or time. They shall rule forever. Even bitter Juno, whose fear now harries earth and sea and heaven, will change to better counsels and will cherish the race that wears the toga, Roman masters of all the world. It is decreed. Thus Virgil on the Romans. And thus that Roman sense, and we'll come back to this in a later lecture, that the world would last exactly as long as Rome. It is decreed. Now, not everything in Augustus's time was quite so serious and somber. For example, the poet Ovid, born in 43 BC, died in 18 AD, was learned, was accomplished, was prolific. I emphasize again the technical mastery of these Augustan poets. I mean, before they ever said anything, they were extremely gifted, skillful writers or composers of poems. Now, Ovid wrote love elegies, the amores, the loves, for which he's well known. A didactic spoof, The Art of Love. It's a sort of a seduction manual. It's kind of a manual on how a man might have his way with a lady. And he wrote an epic scale encyclopedia of mythological tales, the Metamorphoses, the great changes. There is in Ovid a spirit of play. There's also a very powerful sense, a sense of deep feeling. He betrays something else, too. He's immensely learned. Ovid knows a lot. But it is perhaps his feelings which are clearest. You may recall that when we were talking about the Roman Republic, and after I'd been stressing the sturdy, manly values of the Roman Republic, I then quoted Catullus for you. So here, one of Ovid's poems. Maidens, give ear, and you shall hear. What is your chiefest duty? Pray listen well, and I will tell you how to keep your beauty. 'Tis care that makes the barren earth produce the ripened grain. 'Tis care that brings tree fruit to birth, with grafting and much pain. Things that are cared for always please, and now each man's a dandy. A girl must be as spruce as he, and have her powder handy. So, Ovid could be technically accomplished and a bit playful as well. Now, he got a little bit too playful, actually, and for a period of time, Augustus, ever stern Augustus, exiled him from Rome, but eventually he came back, and his poetry has survived as a delight and entertainment of the Western tradition ever since. A bit different is the elegant Horace, 65 to 8 BC, sage, urbane, Epicurean. He was prized in his own time. He's been prized ever since. He has been seen as perhaps the most technically accomplished of all the Roman poets. He was patronized by a man named Maecenas. Maecenas, indeed, who gives his name to patrons and to patronage throughout the Western tradition. Horace was one of those who flourished under Augustus, one of those kind of people who was provided an opportunity in this particular regime to do all that he was able to do. He wrote odes, he wrote epodes, he wrote satires, he wrote letters, he wrote a treatise on poetry. Again, a man of considerable learning, of considerable breadth, of considerable ability. Here's a 17th century translation of one of the odes. All translations, of course, are in some ways interpretations. It wouldn't perhaps be entirely helpful for me to read you these poems in Latin. So the last time modern translations of Ovid and Virgil, here is a 17th century translation of one of Horace's odes. Strive not, look on away, to know what end the gods above to me or thee will send, nor with astrologers consult at all, that thou mayest know what better can befall. Whether thou livest more winters, or thy last, be this, which Tyrrhene waves gainst rocks do cast. Be wise, drink free, and in so short a space do not protracted hopes of life embrace. Whilst we are talking, envious time doth slide. This day's thine own, the next may be denied. You note the Epicurean tone there. Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow you die. Of the future, who can say? Thus far, the poets of the Golden Age. No less epic in scale, no less uncommonly beautiful in language, but all in prose, was the great Roman history of Livy. Titus Livius was born in 59 BC. He died in 17 AD. We may say in a very real way that Livy did in prose what Virgil had done in verse. He told the Romans the tale they wanted to hear about themselves. Livy's history is, again, virtue on display. It's a long parade of remarkable characters. The chances are very good that if anyone listening to my words is familiar with any stories from early Roman history, one has probably got them from Livy, though possibly also from Virgil. It's not unlike the situation now where if you hear a familiar quotation, you know, if you wager that it came either from the Bible or Shakespeare, you win your wager more often than not, you see. Well, if we were playing that game with Roman texts, you'd wager Livy or Virgil, and you'd usually win your wager. Now, it's also important to say with respect to Livy that he was a very earnest historian. He did an enormous amount of research. He consulted a great many records. And in the process, he tells us a very great deal of what we actually know about early Rome and about how the Romans in the time of Augustus constructed their own past. Now, I draw out the word constructed there because this implies an issue that is very, very important to certain critics of literature and of history in our own times, and that is the idea that there may be an objective reality out there, but that if I write about that reality, I'm going to project myself on it. I'm going to construct a reality. I'm going to make a history that I need, a history that talks to me, a history that is useful to me. I may, along the way, say a lot of things that are quite true, but I may also put, as we would say, a certain spin on them. Well, in many respects, Livy spun early Roman history. And it is he who then gives us all of these remarkable tales about those noble Romans of all. Well, the period after the death of Augustus, down really to the very first years of the 2nd century, produced another literary outpouring, which scholars have generally referred to as the Silver Age. This was a time when history was written, but also philosophy, rhetoric, satire. In other words, literature in a variety of genres. And the variety is interesting and is also revealing of, I think, the creative tensions and the creative capacities of this age. Now, it's also true that silver is imagined to be a bit less precious than gold. So the idea is that the world of Virgil and Ovid and Horace and of Livy is somehow superior to the world of the people about whom we shall speak now. Making such cultural judgments is tricky business at the very best. But in any case, we refer then to the writers who come after Augustus as having lived in the Silver Age. We landed with Livy when we talked about the Golden Age. Let's begin the Silver Age and talk about some historians. Tacitus, first of all. Cornelius Tacitus, 55 to about 117 AD is when he lived. You may just recall that we talked about Tacitus as having been the person who understood the Roman Principate very well, who had said the Romans made a great desert and called it peace, and who had said it is the army that can make and unmake the emperor, real powers in the hands of the army. Tacitus was incomparably the greatest of Rome's imperial historians. Now, he wrote a couple of short books. He wrote a book on Britain, for example, which, remember, had been conquered in the 1st century. He wrote a book on Germany. Really, it's the Rhineland. It's the frontier between the Roman province of Gaul and what we would think of as Germany today, which the Romans never conquered. But he wrote a monograph on the peoples who lived along the frontier there. But he wrote 2 larger works, the Histories and the Annals, which went back early into Roman history and came and brought the story down to his own times. Now, he created very fine pen portraits of individuals. He had a very cunning and discerning judgment of individuals. But like so many Roman writers before him, he took as part of his task, he took perhaps as one of his greatest responsibilities, to put virtue and vice on display and to make very, very clear what he thought about each. Fundamentally, Tacitus was faced with an interesting problem. He was faced with the problem of describing an imperial regime, some of whose benefits and advantages and good qualities he saw, and yet at the same time, he was a man, I suppose we might say, republican to his core. He hated tyranny, and he hated tyrants. And he had to write about a world ruled by tyrants, some of whom, however, he found, at least in some circumstances, sometimes to be admirable. Whether or not Tacitus successfully carried off his treatment of that tension is something that individual readers of his histories will have to decide for themselves. But we would be far the poorer without his trenchant comments, particularly on the 1st century A.D. Less trenchant is Tacitus's contemporary, Suetonius. Suetonius was born about 70 and died in 140. He wasn't a great stylist like Tacitus, and he didn't have the kind of cunning insight that Tacitus did. But he left us a book, The Lives of the 12 Caesars, beginning with Julius Caesar, going right on then through Augustus and on through the 1st century A.D., which created a series of unforgettable portraits of the emperor. Now, scholars have fussed and fidgeted ever since, trying to decide, was he a bit of a satirist? Was he criticizing these emperors? Did he genuinely admire them and create loving, admiring portraits of them? Almost any of these readings of Suetonius is possible, and that's perhaps why he has engaged our interest so effectively and over such a long period of time. Lucan was a Spanish poet and historian who was put to death by Nero. He wrote a book called the Pharsalia, which was a verse account of the civil wars of the late Republican period, and particularly an account of the great battle of Pharsalus. Now, I mentioned that Lucan was Spanish. Here another note enters the music. We begin to see that some of the great writers of the Roman world come not from Rome and not from Italy. Virgil himself, after all, came from northern Italy. Mantua is where he came from. So people come first from Rome, then from wider ranges in Italy, and then gradually from the empire as a whole. You'll recall perhaps in our last lecture we talked a little about the process of Romanization. In a writer like Lucan, we can feel some sense of that Romanization. Well, Lucan, again, is an author whose work is full of trenchant political commentary, and he is another writer who wrote in defense of political freedom, in defense of liberty, against tyrants. Now, this is something interesting. There is a constant chorus of defenses of liberty in a regime of tyrants. We see that in Tacitus. We see that in Suetonius. We see that in Lucan. One can find it again and again and again. People realized, in other words, the tensions of the world they were living in. Among philosophical writers, pride of place in this period goes to the Stoic Seneca. 4 BC to 65 AD is when Seneca lived. Another writer who fell afoul of Nero and was executed by him. He wrote tragedies, which were popular for centuries. He wrote dialogues. He wrote treatises. He wrote letters. He was in many ways the great popularizer of Stoicism for later times. Much of Stoicism filtered through Seneca, or it filtered through the writings of the emperor Marcus Aurelius, who, in addition to being one of the good emperors, indeed the last of them, was also a significant Stoic philosopher. His brooding meditations for centuries were read as the deep reflections of a man faced, I suppose we might say, with the awesome responsibilities of power and a deeply sensitive awareness of his own human shortcomings. It is really his great dialogue with himself. In rhetoric in this period, one name stands out above all others, Quintilian, perhaps about 35 to about 100 AD. His institutions of oratory constituted for Western civilization the standard manual of the rhetorical art until modern times. Now, mentioning Quintilian and reminding ourselves that we've talked about Cicero, a great public orator, we've talked about the place of oratory, for example, in the Athenian assemblies in Greece, reminds us that the ability to speak well in public was crucial to the ancient world. Crucial to their culture, crucial to their government, crucial to their politics. Now, Rome also produced a number of satirists. These Romans could laugh. They weren't always also terribly serious. Lucian, not to be confused with Lucan, of whom we spoke a moment ago, lived from about 125 to 200. Now, he came from Syria, and he wrote in Greek, but very much sort of in a tradition that is now Hellenistic and Roman at once. Lucian poked fun at both real living characters and also at mythological ones. In the end, he poked fun at almost everyone. Lucian is actually very, very funny to read. So too is Juvenal. Juvenal was born in about 60 AD, lived to 136. He wrote 16 verse satires, And what he does here, it's a little bit like the cast of characters that we talked about as having been characteristic of Plautus's plays, sort of a variety of kind of social misfits of one kind or another. But in particular, Juvenal wrote about the travails of the poor, especially poor writers like himself. He was always concerned of why don't people give me more money and help me out more. But in the process, he exposed ambition, pretentiousness, and really with great feeling and with great bitterness, I think it's fair to say, he excoriated people's despicable treatment of each other. His language is rhetorically sophisticated. His message is unsparing. Juvenal's tough. You read Juvenal, you know exactly what, like the best editorial writers today, you know exactly what's on his mind. Martial is different. Let's conclude this discussion of these writers with Martial. Martial was born in about 40 and died in 104, another Spaniard. He composed about 1,500 mostly satirical epigrams. He could be crude, he could be rough for effect, he could be vulgar. He was, however, also a very polished stylist, and at his very best, he was really quite funny. Let me quote you just a few of his very brief epigrams. You disappoint no creditor, you say? True. No one ever thought that you would pay. Or again, you blame my verse to publish? You decline. Show us your own, or cease to carp at mine. Another, the verse is mine, but friend, when you declaim it, it seems like yours, so grievously you maim it. Or finally, why don't I send my book to you, although you often ask me to? The reason's good, for if I did, you'd send me yours, which God forbid. Now, the Principate was also a time of stunning architectural achievements. Let's conclude our reflections on the Golden and Silver Ages with just a few words about some of the most remarkable of these buildings. We may regard Roman architectural achievements as sort of triumphs of civil engineering. The Romans were masters at using, adapting, adopting, extending architectural forms. Remember, we stressed the practical genius of the Romans: borrow things and make them your own and find uses for them that others had never dreamed of before. So often it's the case, whether we're talking about literature or philosophy or architecture. The Romans are not innovators. The Romans are not innovators. Roman creativity rests in finding uses and applications for things designed by others. So we might think, for example, of something like the great aqueduct, the Pont du Gard. Now, the city of Rome, of course, was fed by a series of aqueducts that had to be tended very carefully. But the Pont du Gard in the south of France, one of really the most remarkable of all of Rome's civil achievements, is part of a long aqueduct complex that brought water from the hills near Uzès in the south of France to Nîmes, some 50 miles away. Very characteristic of the Romans. We need water there. It's 50 miles. All right, fine, we'll build an aqueduct. The Romans don't say, oh, gee, we can't do that. Hadrian's Wall, built right across the north of Britain. Now, could Hadrian's Wall, impressive in its ruins even today, could Hadrian's Wall actually have served as a secure frontier between the Scottish hills to the south and England, the Scottish hills to the north, I'm sorry, and England to the south? No, of course not. It was a triumph of Roman engineering. The Romans came in and said, you mess with us, look what we can do. Can you do this? It was an ideological statement in brick and mortar, not really a barrier. In the city of Rome itself, we see examples of the urban amenities that I referred to when I talked about the Romans building cities around the empire and building great buildings there to, again, project their power, to portray their power, but also to make the cities more pleasant places to be. We might think, for example, in the city of Rome itself, of a building like the Pantheon. The Pantheon, a round building, built between 27 and 25 BC initially, with an arched roof and architectural details on the outside. Very interesting. The Romans were among the first to use architectural details as a way to decorate a building and not to serve functional purposes. Now, with its arches, with its relieving arches, with its supporting elements, the Pantheon was in many respects a very bold and creative building. But every element in it was older. Similarly, for example, the Flavian Amphitheater, or the so-called Colosseum in Rome, built late in the 1st century AD. Once again, a building with architectural elements as decorations, a building that would seat 80,000 people for spectacles, a building that put arches on display in a way that is quite pleasing to the eye. And yet, for all of that, a building all of whose elements were older. Today's traveler to the Mediterranean world will bump again and again and again into the buildings of the Roman Principate. Today's students will still read the literature of the Roman Principate. This was a period that marked Western civilization as before it only Periclean Athens had done, and as after it perhaps only Voltaire's Paris would do, although possibly Medici and Florence would be a competitor.